All right, so let's take a deep dive into what's happening over in Ukraine. Keeping up with the news, you've probably seen the recent developments with these long-range missiles
Yeah.
and the possibility that the U.S. might actually allow Ukraine to use them to hit targets inside Russia.
Right.
I mean, that's a big deal. This could be a turning point.
Huge. Yeah, it really could be a significant shift. I mean, think about it. Up until now, the U.S. has been pretty firm on keeping Ukraine's, offensive actions within its own borders.
Yeah.
But now we're hearing these reports that things might be changing.
All right.
Particularly with these ATACMS, these
Yeah.
long-range missiles. And if they get those, well, it could completely change how this war is fought.
And even Zelensky himself seems to be kind of hinting at this. He didn't outright confirm anything, but in a recent statement, he said, today there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for specific actions, but missiles will speak for themselves.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting. It's very carefully worded, right? He's acknowledging all the buzz, but not actually, making any promises.
Right.
But it's also a subtle way of reminding everyone about the pressure Ukraine's been putting on its allies.
To give them these weapons.
Exactly. There's this growing feeling, and not just in Ukraine, but among some Western analysts too, that Putin's not going to come to the negotiating table unless he's really feeling the heat.
Yeah.
Like, he needs to experience some major setbacks on the battlefield.
So why the potential shift now? Why is the U.S. even considering this?
Well, our sources point to a few things.
Okay.
First of all, you can't ignore the pressure from Ukraine itself.
Right.
Zelensky's been very vocal about needing these weapons.
To effectively counter Russia.
Exactly. And then you've got the U.S. elections coming up.
Uh-huh.
This could be a way for the current administration to really solidify its stance on Ukraine.
I see.
Maybe even get ahead of any concerns about potential changes in policy if a new administration comes in.
Right. Right. And then on top of that, we've got those reports about North Korean troops being sent to fight with the Russians.
Oh, yeah. That adds a whole other layer of
Complication.
complication, yeah.
That's got to be up in the ante, right?
Absolutely. North Korea getting involved, that raises the stakes.
Uh-huh.
And it definitely feeds into those worries about this conflict spreading.
Then what about Putin? How's he reacted to all of this?
Well, he's not happy, not surprisingly.
Right.
He's basically drawn another one of his red lines, saying that giving Ukraine these long-range missiles that can hit Russia, that would be considered a direct attack by NATO.
Oh, wow.
And of course, he's warning that this could lead to a much bigger and more dangerous conflict.
So, it sounds like we're teetering on the edge of something much bigger here.
It does, doesn't it?
I mean, the U.S. gives Ukraine these missiles that can hit Russia. Putin considers it a NATO attack.
Right.
It feels like things could really spiral out of control.
Yeah, I think bringing NATO into it, that's a deliberate move on Putin's part. He's trying to frame this as Russia being the victim.
As the West being the aggressor.
Exactly. It's a way to rally support at home and maybe even scare off the U.S. and its allies a little bit.
And then there's the whole nuclear threat hanging over everything.
Yeah.
Putin said it before, he's not afraid to use nuclear weapons if he thinks Russia's in danger.
Right.
Does this move by the U.S. put us closer to that? I mean, is that a real possibility?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The nuclear issue is definitely the scariest part of all of this. Some analysts think Putin's just trying to intimidate people, that it's all talk.
Uh-huh.
But others are seriously worried that things could escalate.
That he might actually use them.
Yeah. I mean, it's so unpredictable. The stakes are incredibly high, and it's hard to know what he's really thinking.
It's like we're watching this high-stakes poker game and trying to figure out who's bluffing and who's got the winning hand.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the thing is, in this game, the chips are people's lives.
That's right. And that's something I wanted to bring up. We've been focusing on the politics and the military stuff, but what about the human cost of all this?
Right.
The people in Ukraine, they're the ones living through this nightmare.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the strategic side of things, but we can't forget about the human side of this war. Millions of Ukrainians have lost their homes, countless lives have been lost, and the trauma of this conflict is going to last for generations.
It's a good reminder that behind all the headlines and policy decisions, there are real people whose lives are being torn apart.
Yeah, their stories are important too. Their resilience, their determination to keep going, that matters just as much as any geopolitical analysis.
So what happens next? If the U.S. does give Ukraine these long-range missiles, What are some possible outcomes?
Well, there are a few scenarios we could see play out. It's possible that this actually forces Russia to negotiate.
Really?
Yeah, by making the conflict more costly for Russia, by showing that the U.S. is willing to escalate, maybe Putin will be more open to a settlement.
So it's a gamble.
It is a big gamble, definitely. And there's always the chance that it backfires, that it leads to a wider conflict like Putin's been saying. It could also make the fighting in Ukraine even more intense, even more brutal.
How so?
Well, Russia might retaliate by targeting civilians even more, attacking infrastructure, maybe even using chemical weapons.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the worst-case scenario, a full-blown war between Russia and NATO.
That's what everyone's trying to avoid.
Right. That would be catastrophic. The consequences would be felt around the world.
And then there's the nuclear threat on top of all that.
Exactly. The potential for things to spiral out of control is very real.
It feels like we're at a crossroads here. Like, what happens next could determine the entire course of this conflict and maybe even the future of global security.
Yeah, it feels like we're standing on the edge of something looking out at all these different paths, but we can't really see where they lead. You know, we can imagine the possibilities, negotiations more, fighting even something unthinkable, but where it all ends up.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, isn't it?
That's the thing about this situation. There's so much uncertainty. We can't predict the future.
Right.
But what we can do is try to understand what's driving things, you know, the motivations, the risks, the consequences.
And that's what we're doing here, right? Trying to give everyone listening the information they need to make sense of this.
Exactly. The more you know, the better equipped you are to deal with it. And in a situation like this where things are so tense, being informed is crucial.
So if we zoom out a bit, look at the big picture. What are the main takeaways from all this?
Yeah.
What should people be thinking about as this story develops?
I think there are a couple of really key points. First, this situation, it really highlights how fragile things are in the world right now. You know, the international order, the rules-based system, it's all being challenged in a very serious way.
Right.
And second, this conflict in Ukraine, it's not just a regional issue, it's got global consequences.
Like what kinds of consequences?
Well, it could change alliances, redraw borders, shift the balance of power.
And this decision about sending long-range missiles, it's not just about Ukraine either.
No, it's not. It's about setting a precedent, establishing a new normal for how wars might be fought in the future.
I see.
The whole world's watching this to see what happens. If the U.S. gives Ukraine these missiles, and it does lead to a bigger conflict, like Putin's threatened, that could embolden other countries to try the same thing in their own disputes.
So the stakes are even higher than we thought.
Yeah, we're potentially talking about a major shift in how countries interact with each other, a move towards a world that's much less stable, much more unpredictable.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
This has been a really insightful discussion. I always appreciate your perspective on these complex issues. And for everyone listening, stay informed, stay engaged, and don't lose hope. We need people who are informed, who are willing to ask the tough questions and work towards peaceful solutions.